Okay, I'm Lisa Kessler. I teach photography in the Department of Art History and Film. Yes, we have a new name to remember. And I am a working photographer and artist, and I definitely work in this genre in the sense of, how should I say it? My first introduction to photography was through the work of people like Cartier-Bresson. The idea of the purpose of photography is to go out into the world and explore and understand the world, and then create your own interpretation of it, your own subjective understanding of it. So it's nice to be here. It's a great exhibit.
Hi, I am Greer Muldowney. I'm a visiting assistant professor in the art history and film department. And I've been at Boston College for 6 years now. This is my 6th year. And I'm excited to talk about this show. My work is more landscape based, but I think like all of us, we get thrown into street photography. Most of our introduction is 35mm. And it's nice to be in this show and think about the history of street photography and what that means, and how it is still very much something that's carried on, including by Carl Baden, who curated the show, who is also a photography professor here. So I'm excited to talk about it.
Let's see, where should we start? Well, I'll start by talking about what I love about the work, and then maybe I can come up with a question for you.
Okay, or maybe I can ask you a qualifying question.
All right, all right. I should say that I first saw this work maybe 3 or so years ago when I brought my class in to a visit with Diana Larson, who manages the collection, and she brought out all this historical work. We weren't specifically talking about street photography. It was just, let's see what you have. And then she had this roll, and she said, I don't know, I like these, and so here, take a look, what do you think? I'm like, well, these are pretty interesting. What's going on here? So, what's exciting about the work is, for those of you who haven't seen it or don't know a lot about it, is that they're taken in 1977, I think, the New York City subways with 35mm handheld film cameras, which is what our students still use in our introductory classes. And the photographer, Alen MacWeeney, I don't know when he actually put these together. I don't know if it was close to the time of when he made the work. Do you know?
I had that question too, actually, when they were scanned. Was it a recent assemblage when he returned to the work in the recent decades, or was it always intended to be this way?
Well, I did read one little thing that said that when he was working with the material, with the prints, he had them kind of thrown around, and he realized that there were relationships between the prints just like as they fell on each other. But he then scanned them and butted up 2 images, and so each of these panoramas, you'll see they're like also slightly different widths because he used different proportions of each print, of each image. So the 2 things that are interesting to me are that it's from a time. It's one of the great things about street photography, photographing the world. It's that you're photographing the world as it is in the moment, and it's often only later that moment is more engaging to us, right? The way we look at the world today, we're used to it, so it just is what it is, and it's always it can be a challenge sometimes for us to get students to start seeing photographically and to see the possibilities that are in the world that we live in today, And then the benefit here is, okay, now we're looking back at, a period in history, at a world that doesn't exist in exactly the same way. So it has a historical interest, but then of course the way they're butted up to each other creates these distortions of reality. I particularly like where he has an interior perspective butted up with an exterior perspective, which I think can speak to how a lot of us experience reality. Like we're in one place, but maybe our mind is somewhere else. And so I love that visually and kind of philosophically.
I have a question about that actually. So some of the images are definitely more seamless than others.
Mm-hmm.
This one is kind of abrupt, you can see the seam, but others create a very strange reality.
Yeah.
The image that is adjacent to us, we can't see in this video right now, but it was on the show card. That one kind of distorts, yes, kind of distorts vision. And how do you feel about that and how they really were paired beyond the idea of the internal external, which I think is a really good observation, and I didn't think of it that way because I thought it was more of a bending of these realities and shape shifting of thinking about the subway or thinking about that particular the realities that these people were in.
Ah, but how do you mean? Like he's contrasting, like where she is and where they are on the left?
Because I mean, you spoke about this a little bit earlier, and you think this is ahead of its time, and it's actually interesting to hear that little snippet because, we've been pairing images, diptychs, triptychs, etc. You can always, images are always going to be in relation to each other, but this is different. This
is pushing it.
Almost, it's collage in a way. It's very simple, almost trying to trick the eye, kind of a collage. So how do you feel about that treatment specifically?
Well, that's, I think it's ahead of its time in a couple ways. One, that I wanted to say before, one part that I love about this work is that it's interior street photography, right? The whole tradition of street photography, most of it, except like Walker Evans' subway work, which is around the corner, and I'm sure there are plenty of other examples, but the tradition of street photography is that it's outdoors. And, in my own work, I've always been more drawn to interiors. And, and of course, we talk about Donna Ferrato and that whole thing. But, so I love that he's working indoors because it's much more challenging technically to work indoors because you don't have a lot of light.
It's an understatement. Photographing on the subway is not great.
It's not great. It's tough. So there's that element, and so I love the indoor, outdoor, and then what was the other thing that you asked?
Kind of the trickery of the eye,
Oh, the
how they're mashed up.
Yeah, so I think that it's a very, I was saying to Greer before that I think that this is a very contemporary interpretation of a kind of traditional way of seeing, like taking traditional, we call it straight photography, where your image is your full negative and that's it. And certainly at this time in the late 70s and until the 80s probably, almost every photographer was making an image from a negative and then matting it and framing it in a black metal frame and hanging it up on a wall. That was...
Calling it a day.
And call it a day, and that was it. And so for MacWeeney to think about doing something completely different and breaking that classical idea of what black and white photography is, I think was ahead of his time. And like I said, I don't know when he did this. I don't know if he brought more contemporary thinking to it to do these scannings in, but it would be nice to know that. But in any case, the fact that he did it is, I think, pretty cool.
Yeah, I think some of them are very successful as the compositions flow into each other, maybe more so than the singular image themselves, right? Which I don't want to get, He's Mr. McMullen, I'm not trying to disrupt it, but I think that there is something to be said as like a full piece and thinking about those compositions that does elevate it. We've kind of hinted at the show that's also next door that is also from the collection of the McMullen that does get into the root of the history of street photography. So do we want to maybe reference that or think about how this is within that context?
Go for it, and then I do want to ask you about your experience with your students in here, so whichever way you want to go.
And when you come into this exhibition, it's actually, it's very intimate with these, and they're hung kind of like in boxcar style, like to mimic the train. And then you finish in this very intimate space with a few images by Donna Ferrato, Aaron Siskin, Walker Evans, and Bernice Abbott. And I think that, the turn of the last century, thinking about Bernice Abbott and what she, not even her work, but even what she contributed in thinking about Auger and who she brought into the limelight. It's so great to think about the lineage and this point in the 70s and 80s where things start to kind of crack apart, right? Color photography comes in, we're already seeing the influx of the advertisement and what that kind of meant, how that broke down, especially thinking about postmodernism. Postmodernism kind of kills street photography, right? Not to say that we're not still doing it, but I think it's really interesting to get from Walker Evans to this and see the use of text and the use of this kind of humanity kind of come full circle just with a few images. So I think even though this is a small show, I found it really interesting to have those on display together.
Yeah. So should I ask you to explain more what you mean, that postmodern?
Oh yeah, I just went total
yeah, go for it, come on.
Teacher mode, sorry guys.
No, tell us what you think.
So, I mean, if you think of mid-century, modernist photographers in street photography, you get from Walker Evans to, the big three in New Documents, which was Diane Arbus, Lee Friedlander, Winogrand, there's definitely a class of folks after that in the 70s, like McWeeney, maybe Sternfeld, Davidson, Bruce Davidson, and those guys after, but that high modernist idea of go define the world with a very specific artistic vision gets broken down by the postmodernists because, with the exception of thinking about a few people like Abbott and Arbus, people of color aren't in there, women aren't in there, the voice is very male-centric, right? And when you get to postmodernism, we start to question everything, including the straight photography view. Right. Even though this is very specifically, his point of view, and then putting this mashup together that is a postmodern idea of this isn't what you're seeing, this isn't what we're working with. And then the idea, I keep pointing to something that is not on camera, but we have this disruption of this advertisement and another image that also starts to kind of speak to that. And I wonder if he was aware of that because that was something that was very much starting to come into the zeitgeist at the same time. Yeah. So that's kind of what I was pointing at. Yeah.
So I didn't bring my students in to see this show, but I know you did. Your, I think it's interesting that you brought your digital class in, which means that they're working in color, or certainly it's native in color digital photography. They can translate to black and white. And I guess at the same time I am thinking a little bit about the next important subway project that was done in the history of photography. I mean, say the one before was maybe Walker Evans photographing very surreptitiously on the subway in New York and capturing a kind of quieter view, a little bit more direct than these pictures. But then Bruce Davidson did this in maybe in the mid-'80s.
Mid to early 80s, yeah.
Yeah, in color, which was a departure for him. And I was looking back at those pictures today.
They're confrontational.
They're very aggressive. They're very confrontational. they're also much more sexual than these pictures are, which I find kind of interesting. So I'm curious how your students responded to this work. Like, do they see it more in terms of the historical nature of these photographs? This isn't what, certainly it's not what the Boston subway looks like, it's not what the New York subways look like today so much. You know, how did they respond to it, and how has it affected the work that they're doing?
Well, what was really interesting when I brought the students, we were a solid month into the semester, so they were just settling into being comfortable with their cameras. And the thing about digital photography is that our students are digital natives, so that whole class is actually to get people to slow down. So coming here right before we were starting to print, and to think of the objects like these are hung on, like you're looking at the object, it's not in a frame, it's not in that white matte black frame, it's right here on the wall. And then we also looked at more of the prints from the collection, which I think was really great. We slowed down, we only looked at the two shows and about a dozen prints tops, and purposefully to slow down and think about individual images. But we had done, I had done a history lecture, and we had done some research on street photography the weeks prior, where we talked about Davidson, and then like we talked about Michael Wolff's Tokyo Drift, which like this is kind of in the same family of, and we looked at the three that we was just talking about from New Documents, and then newer people like Martin Parr and Daido Moriyami and a few others that, you know, kind of, I don't do it in a timeline, I kind of jump all over to think of different perspectives. So they were fully a little probably overwhelmed by the time we got here with artists. But it was nice, and we looked at some colored prints in the collection too. It was a good way for them to understand the lineage from black and white to color, and the rapidity of which you can photograph doesn't necessarily mean that you're thinking about life and how it exists in that timeline. When we came in, I was actually talking about how we came in, the students were trying to root this in time very specifically. So, you know, like, oh, this is the 70s, and then one, you know, eventually one kid actually reads and goes, oh, it's 77. I was like, well, I'm assuming it was within that range. And then they start to say, but this looks newer, this looks like the 70s. That it was an interesting conversation.
Meaning specific images look more contemporary to them?
Where the act of disbelief. Like the one student looked at the girl that's underneath the Lexington Ave sign and was like, oh, I have that scarf.
Oh, really?
She looks,
That's
and
great.
she does look very, you know, there is but there's a timelessness even to the Ferrado images, right? Thinking about some of those. Some of them feel definitely more rooted in time with the fashion. And then others are just, you know, the street corner is a street corner with beautiful light is a beautiful light. So I think it was good to bring the students through and really just try to get them to understand the idea of the object and what this was trying to, like, viewpoints and different viewpoints, and how different artists really hone in on the same thing completely differently. And I think it was pretty successful. We're still in the semester, but as we are careening for final projects, and I have 4 or 5 of the same students that are still making work in a street. They never left it, even though we've done other things like portraiture and still life, and they're gung-ho about it. So I assume this had an influence on them.
It's interesting because for many years I have found that students are very uncomfortable talking to strangers, photographing strangers, calling people up on the phone, you know, anything, forget it. And at the same time, they also really want to do it.
Yes.
and so this is such a great starting point, I think, for them to think about, well, how do you actually stand in a position? Like, where do you put yourself, and how do you take a photograph of these people who are right, you know, this far from you, and have it be candid. You know, how do you do that? And they want to do that, and they're afraid because I remember a student recently said in the class, well, am I allowed to do that? You know, can I do that? And you know, so we talk about the legal aspects and the ethical aspects.
Yeah, we spent a long time on that one, yeah.
Yeah, but so my question is was it empowering for them to see, like were they interested in the logistics of, like, how do you can do this, I can do this?
So every semester when I do a street photography unit, so we look at it and they have to go do it. And they do get very excited. I think they were more excited because I spent 2 weeks on the history, one here and then in lecture, so they got twice as much information about it. And they get so excited, and then they always come back, and I inevitably called, oh, you didn't have a cloak of invisibility, right? Like, this image gives us, it's like the viewer, the gaze, right? And like, we have the freedom to stare at these people forever because they are forever in this moment.
Right.
And when you're in the photographic moment,
Yeah.
there is a reciprocation.
Or not.
Or not, if, you know, depending on how they're shooting and what they want out of it, or how stealthy they are. But ultimately, the discussion that I find really interesting, and I've had it a few times now, is the students are like, it's really hard. And I go, yeah, that's why it's in a museum. Like, it is, we are looking at the people who are so good at it and were so impassioned about it, and really wanted to do that, and, you know, maybe got into a fist fight, or maybe got yelled at, you know.
Or maybe had to wait 2 hours until there was an interesting situation.
4 rolls of film, like Cartier-Bresson, as you mentioned earlier, right? To get that one puddle jump, right? So it's, I always say, it's not that I'm giving you this assignment so that you're gonna be a master at it, because no. But because you have to appreciate the people that
Yeah.
are, and like fall in love with it, or realize that it's just not that simple.
Yeah.